So once again, welcome to What Nonprofits Need to Know About Data Privacy in 2021. This is a webinar from Elevation, and I am Emily. I'm joined today by my colleague, Chris, as well as a special welcome to Eric Kangas, who is joining us as a panelist today as a HIPAA specialist. Eric has over 30 years of experience and expertise in software architecture, data security, and HIPAA compliance. And he's the CEO and founder of Luxi, which provides fully HIPAA compliant and robust solutions for secure data communications and web hosting services. So we're very lucky to have such a tech specialist join us today as we go over some of the data privacy laws and concerns as we begin 2021. So a little bit about me. I am the Communications and Partnerships Manager at Elevation. That's within our marketing department. And some of my passions include community building and behavioral psychology. So I'm really glad to be using those roles in helping nonprofits. And I am myself a volunteer nonprofit board member. So it's wonderful to be able to combine these different aspects of my life in that sense.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris. I'm the customer success lead here at Elevation. I've done some work for a lot of different nonprofits. I'm really interested in racial justice, individuals with disabilities, and especially involved with a lot of the arts. I used to teach guitar to nonprofits, or working with nonprofits in the DC area. I also used to do a lot of work with glass art previously, and these days I'm working more in the digital sector and working a lot with nonprofits, trying to get their websites to reach more people and trying to get them to be as successful as possible in the virtual realm. So to give you guys a bit of an introduction to Elevation, what we do here. So we're a full-service digital agency specializing in nonprofit organizations and the social sector. And we were founded back in 2007. And we have lots of specialists that deal with a number of different parts of the digital sector. So we can do things like creating your website from scratch. We also have services like UX, digital marketing, and design. And yeah, we're excited to be here, and hopefully you guys will be getting some good information from this webinar today. Great, so the main sections of our webinar today are the following. So we're gonna start with an overview of kind of where the trends are right now in terms of data privacy, talking a bit about the social trends, but also where the legislation kind of is in 2021. After that, we're going to be looking at what are your responsibilities as a nonprofit in terms of securing your information, and kind of what are the rights of the users, the people who own the information that you might be collecting on your website or anywhere in your computer systems or otherwise. Then we're going to have a workshop style section where you're going to be able to evaluate the risk of data privacy at your organization. So it's going to be divided into a few different sections, and we'll go through those slowly so that you'll be able to have a decent idea of what is the level of risk for your nonprofit. And then after that, we're going to look at a few steps to achieve compliance at your nonprofit. Okay, great. So there, you want to take it away, Emily?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump right into the state of data privacy now at the beginning of 2021. And of course, Eric, I'm sure you may have some interesting thoughts to share as well with our audience today. But as a general overview, I just want to kind of highlight that how much of an undercurrent data privacy was over the past year in 2020. So maybe not a term that, or phrase that we heard talked about at the top of the news headlines, considering all that happened, but actually directly connected to a lot of the things that happened in the last year. So of course, the first being that there's been a huge growth in the use of tech as a result of COVID-19. You know, a lot more happening remotely, you know, many more people spending hours using tech for learning, for their jobs, for connecting socially. And all of that means a huge surge in the amount of personal digital data out there. We also are seeing a trend that began before this year, but it's something that frames kind of this whole context and why this data privacy legislation has been introduced, why it's a concern. So Gen Y and the younger generations are more willing to share personal data than previous generations, and that has both benefits and concerns. A huge benefit, for example, as a nonprofit, your supporters are more willing to let you know about the issues that they care about when is a good time to reach them, where they're located, and lots of information that is valuable to engaging your supporters and understanding them better, and also for engaging with your beneficiaries, right? There is a flip side to this as well, though. So there are a lot of societal concerns that extremism is feeding off of personal data. So we saw this specifically in the past year. We had some US congressional hearings around this issue. We saw the hashtag delete Facebook trending, particularly among NGOs. We also have seen societal concerns about profiting off of people's personal information, right? So US presidential candidate Andrew Wang was, one of his platforms was around data dividends. Hard to believe with the year that we've been through, but that was actually the beginning of 2020, back in just February and March. We also saw CCPA legislation, which is California legislation, which is quite strict around data privacy, became enforceable this year, as well as the New York Shield law, another stricter data privacy law that became enforceable. And throughout all of this, you know, GDPR caused a lot of uproar when it was put into practice back in 2018. But we're seeing that even though the UK has now left the EU fully and Brexit's complete, there is now a UK GDPR. So all signs that these data privacy issues are not going anywhere. And I don't know if, Eric, you'd like to add anything about sort of what you've observed. We didn't specifically mention HIPAA here because that's, of course, has been around for a few more years. And it's, you know, it's a certain types of data privacy. But if you'd like to add anything about what has happened or what you've observed, certainly welcome that.
Sure. I think what we're seeing is that lots of different organizations, countries are putting shims into place to try to address different kinds of privacy. For example, you know, GDPR and California are identifying individual protected information, HIPAA all around medical information. So they're different pieces, and a lot of them are trying to address different aspects of security. So like GDPR is very much around, can you identify it? What are you doing with it? Do you protect it? But not so much around sort of like transmission encryption, other things that might be under HIPAA, right? So you're seeing puzzle pieces that somewhat overlap and somewhat don't overlap that are creating a constellation. And so what we're going to be seeing, I think, as the future rolls along, is that these pieces are going to expand until they're mostly the same, right? As people get used to them, as people try to figure out how am I going to comply with these things that seem different, but they're the same. Like how am I going to protect medical information on one hand and all my users' personal information on the other hand? Why don't I treat them the same? You know, that's easier from a technical point of view. So that's what we're going to see, I think, and it's going. I think, and we'll talk about this later when you get into risk analysis and sort of plans. As some of the questions coming into the chat already is like, what do we do? It's like you try to create a comprehensive thing that's going to protect all of the data in a consistent way. It's going to simplify it for you, and it's going to make it so that, like, even if you're a young organization, you're not, you know, checking all the check boxes for all the regs, because you can't do that at the very beginning. At least you can be substantially, you know, have a good plan that's going to meet most of what you have to do, and that's, you know, you have to start somewhere, and so that's a good way of approaching it.
Awesome. I love how you phrase that, because I think that's one of the most common questions, is trying to understand how all of these pieces fit together. And that's where a lot of the confusion comes from, is trying to understand that constellation. And then what we're really seeing is that it's not a checkbox that's a one-off thing, one-time thing. It's really about building a cultural approach to how you think about people's personal information. And I'll definitely elaborate more on this as we go along. So, you know, most concern to you as we shift from this wider context is how that affects you specifically as a nonprofit. So as we move into that, this is data privacy is really a question of risk. That's kind of the first way to approach it. It's similar to fundraising compliance in terms of the legal obligations in some senses. So for example, this is a very US specific example, but charitable solicitation registration in the US, it's state by state. You know, and it's certainly country by country. In the UK, you have different requirements and so forth, and that depends on which territory within the UK as well. So we're already seeing on the fundraising end that compliance is something that can get quite expensive, unfortunately. It's time consuming. It's imperfect because frankly, it's very hard that, you know, maybe you have one donation from the Falkland Islands. And so you're worried about fundraising compliance in the Falkland Islands, or do you try and do the best that you can within, you know, your means and what's reasonable. So it's a little bit imperfect, but it's also extremely important because it is what lays a foundation of trust, both at the individual level in terms of, you know, people feel a lot better about making their donation when they know that you are a registered charity or a registered nonprofit, right? That helps them. It also builds trust in terms of think back 100 years when there was no such thing as a charity registry. And so, you know, someone could just show up at your door and claim that they are from a charitable organization and you had no way of knowing if your donation was actually going to the cause that you were being told it was going to. So there are good reasons to have these compliance issues, and they serve the greater good. I mean, nonprofits and charities benefit from a lot of special status considerations. So when you think about the tax benefits and a lot of benefits that are made available from both the public and private sector to nonprofits, you know, the fact that there are sort of these compliance issues help make this available. So they are beneficial in terms of building trust, even though they do kind of cause these additional complications or hoops to jump through. So data privacy compliance is also very much a journey. You know, you might think of it like maintaining a building. I'm pulling analogies from all over the place today, and hopefully some of them resonate with you. They're things that have helped me to understand this issue better. So, you know, when you move into a new building or new building for an organization, you know, maybe the first thing you do is you change the locks and you get everyone a key. Now, when you have a new person who needs to access the building, you're going to need a new copy of that key. You may need to change the lock in the future. And maybe everything was great when you first moved in, but now the emergency lighting system has gone kaput and you're going to have to deal with that and get a new one. So these are ongoing journeys. And they're also very much cultural. So thinking specifically to some laws, which we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, further on in this presentation, but to cite two, GDPR, which is the EU, and SHIELD, which is New York, they both provide mandates for the end result, which is data protection, but they really leave how to comply up to the organization. So they're not telling you these laws particularly, but many of them are following suit. They're not telling you you need this software or you need exactly these steps. They're saying you need to do whatever needs to be done to protect individuals' data. It's very important to know that a breach at a third-party vendor is legally also a breach to the organization. So if you are, you know, processing your data or hosting your data in the cloud, in software, you know, and there is a breach at that vendor, you are legally responsible because that is your data, that is your organization's data that you're hosting with them. And it's also important to consider that ethical obligations may extend further than your legal obligations. So for example, say you work with migrant workers, undocumented workers, migrant workers, and perhaps you're in a situation where legally, you know, you don't have to be so stringent with data, but knowing that if these people were to be identified as undocumented workers, you could put them at risk. You could put them at risk for you know, in terms of their legal situation, even in terms of a political situation, So it's possible that your ethical obligations extend beyond your legal ones, and that's really why it's important to start with this question of risk. And how that interacts with legal responsibilities, right? So again, we'll continue to go into this more, but the laws that are going to be applicable to your nonprofit are not determined by where your organization is based, but rather where your audience is a resident or citizen. So you could be a nonprofit in Alabama, but if you have donors, or certainly nowadays staff with a number of remote workers, or beneficiaries, right, who are an EU citizen, you could have a dual citizen, then GDPR is going to still apply. If you have a donor, or even someone who is accessing your programming remotely on the internet from New York State, then New York law is going to apply. So it's similar to the fundraising compliance that we're seeing with online donations, that the internet is making us a little bit messy. And I think that's what Eric was speaking to a little bit, and that as these pieces are falling into place, it really becomes much easier to kind of think of all of your data. It's easier for you to kind of enact the security and the privacy that is necessary to keep everything safe, because there are all these different bits and pieces, and hopefully there will be a bit more sort of consistency in the future, that these laws will move towards that. So as I was sort of giving an example before, the legal interpretation is that these laws kind of essentially apply everywhere, because of this issue that if someone is a resident or a citizen of any of these locations, the laws still protect them, and you are responsible to those laws, even though as a nonprofit, you're not located in any of those places. Another sort of bit about these laws, and it's adding to some of the confusion, I think, is that each law does differently define terms in terms of, what is personal information, as well as rights. So the constituents' rights might be different. They're different in the HIPAA law versus GDPR. Sometimes it's as simple as the obligation for the nonprofit is simply to inform the constituent of a data breach. It could be that a constituent is allowed to request a human review of an automated decision. Say you decided that somebody is not eligible for a loan based on certain data. It could be a special sort of a community-based loan. It could be rights to prohibit the sale of their own personal data. It could be the right to receive a usable copy of all of their data. And it could be the right to have to give consent to any use of their data. So those all depend on which law, and we'll go into more of that farther on in this presentation. So another suggestion I have in terms of beginning to approach this issue is that I think of another analogy as a doctor or a lawyer passing the boards. So if you're thinking about, where am I gonna take the exams for my professional certification? Well, if I take it in one state which has minimum requirements, right, I'll only be legally set to operate in that one state. But if I pick a state that's actually, perhaps a little bit harder for those boards, I'm actually set up then, if I do the boards in California or New York, I may be prepared then to practice in several states. So similar thing, that if you step up, it's a much better use of your time. If you have to do some level of compliance anyway, it's a better use of your time to go after the widest practice of data privacy that you can, given your capacity, right? Obviously there's some understanding of balancing that, but it will benefit you to be as best prepared as you can, given your capacity. And from there, to start to really get into an understanding of what compliance may look like for you, Chris is going to lead us through a little bit of a risk assessment, because that's really the place where to start. Although I do want to give, I don't know if Eric wants to jump in with anything else before we start the risk assessment.
Yeah, I would like to expound on what you were just saying, because it's a really important and confusing point when you're talking about being as general as you can, because from the one point of view, it is so important to cover everything that you can in terms of the data, the transmission, all of your internal policies, be as broad as you can and not narrow, because that protects you overall. On other aspects, though, it's good to be narrow. For example, when you're signing contracts with potential customers, let's say there's a contract from a customer who's in California, and it's around, like, this is something we've encountered, like it's under medical, so it's under HIPAA. CCPA has an exemption for HIPAA. So if you agree to the HIPAA stuff, you don't have to agree to the CCPA stuff. So like just knowing what you have to do for a particular customer and then limiting your contracts to that particular item will actually lower your risk by you not having to agree to be more broad than you have to for a specific engagement. Or similarly, if you never do anything with anybody in Switzerland because of the nature of your business, it doesn't make sense for you to go and have all the Swiss EU specialty laws and then like someone in Switzerland who can be your liaison for what, right? So if you just carve that out, then so being understanding of what the scope of the engagements in general in particular are and being broad within that is really good.
Okay, so we've arrived at the risk assessment portion of our presentation. So for this section, it's important that everyone has either maybe just a piece of paper and a pen or a Word document or something, so you can take a few notes during this section, because we're going to be doing a few calculations, and you're going to be taking notes for those calculations to figure out generally what is your level of risk. So before we get into that interactive portion, it is important that we take a look at what exactly are the types of information that we should be thinking about during this exercise. So this is going to be a word that you might hear a lot during this presentation. This is personally identifiable information, PII. So this is any information that could be used to identify a person. So we have a list here of some of the examples. Think about usernames plus security question combination, photographs, voice recordings, any types of government ID, union membership, political leanings, religion, and then the list goes on. So go ahead and take a look at this list right now and kind of think about also what are the ways in which you are collecting information as well. This could be any types of registration forms. Think about the types of fields that you would list on there. Think about information that you collect from your donors, and also any information that you can collect for your benefactors or beneficiaries. I did want to touch just on a few of these down at the bottom of the slide. If you could go back, there we go. And customer reference numbers, customer reviews, cookies like on your web browsers, and even thinking about visitors logs. Think about the types of places that visitor logs might be used, and even something as simple as that could be considered this type of private information that people don't want public in any way. And those ones specifically at the bottom of the slide might apply a bit more in the EU. So moving on to the interactive portion, hopefully everybody has a piece of paper and a pen, or just something that they can take a few notes here. So the way this is going to work, we're going to be calculating a few different scores. We're starting with the volume score, and the volume score is dealing with the quantity of information. So for each of these statements, if you can say yes to the statement, then give yourself 1 point. And then at the end of each section, you're going to add up all the points to get the total for that score. So we'll start with the volume score. We only have 3 statements, so we're going to get a score between 0 and 3 for your organization. The first one, we collect PII for clients or donors and staff. So if you can say yes to that, give yourself 1 point. Next, we have this data for more than 1,000 people. So again, think about donors, think about anybody whose information you could be collecting. The last one, most service staff have access to all client PII. So think about where this data is being stored. Is it in a secure place? Do only a few people have access to that? Or is it in a place where any of your employees can access that, whether it be virtual or a physical paper in a filing cabinet? Think about who has access to that PII. Okay, so you should have a score.
Really quickly
Sure, go
add,
ahead.
in addition to employees, think about volunteers, because sometimes people forget if your volunteers have access to all client PII as well. You want to think about this in that equation. Right.
Great, thanks, Emily. Great. So we're just going to set that score aside. We're going to be using that again later. Now we're going to be calculating a value score. So this value score is about what types of information you're collecting. So just like the last time, if you can say yes to the statement, give yourself 1 point, and you will see a few statements down further on this list that are weighted a little more heavily. And for those, we're going to give 2 points if you can say yes to that statement. So first, we collect government ID numbers for clients. So this could be a driver's license, passport, any type of government issued identification that could link back to a specific individual. Next, we collect medical history information. Okay. We, not a third-party payment processor, collect bank account or credit card information. So think about your donation forms on your websites, for example. Is that getting stored locally on your computers, on your website, and not just by the third-party payment processor? We collect information about financial history. Okay, now we're getting into the section that's weighted a little more heavily. Many of our constituents are minors. So if you can say yes to this, you would add 2 points instead of 1. Many of our constituents are undocumented. Again, add 2 points if you say yes to this one. And many of our constituents are people convicted of crimes. So again, 2 points for this statement as well. Okay, and then we have 3 more here. So if we collect information about race, we're back to 1 point for this statement. We collect information about sexual or gender orientation. And lastly, we collect information about political leanings. Okay, so now take a moment, add up that score. So from your value score, you should have a number between 0 and 13. So now we have 2 scores. We have the volume score and the value score. So we're going to use those together to calculate a risk rating. So on the left here, we have the volume score, 1, 2, and 3. And then on the top, we have the value score between 1 and 13. So for example, if I got a 2 for my volume score and say a 6 for my value score, I'm lining up where those the row and column combine, and we have medium level of risk. So go ahead and do that for yourself, looking at this graphic, and write that down. Write that down as well. We're going to be using this risk rating for a couple more calculations in the next part here. Okay, so we have our risk rating. Next, we're going to calculate a procedure score. Okay, and we're going to be thinking about kind of what your organization is already doing. What are the policies you already have in place? Same thing here. Every statement is going to be worth 1 point. So first, we explicitly ask clients for consent when collecting information during intake. and when providing services. We track which clients consent to which kinds of data collection and processing. We tell our clients all the ways we will be using their information. Okay. We have documented all the ways we use client data. We have a mechanism for clients to ask us to provide them with a copy of their data. We have a single person responsible for making sure that we keep privacy at top of mind. We have a data deletion or anonymization policy. Okay. We have written policies about how client and staff data may be used and stored. We fill out a security and privacy questionnaire for every vendor we use. And we regularly review the data we are collecting and stop collecting data that we aren't using.
And I know we've already had a few questions about what sorts of questions should be asked of a vendor, what that security and privacy questionnaire might look like, and what that may look like in the contract. So I don't know if, Eric, if you could share in a couple of sentences, explain what that is for people who may be unfamiliar to this concept.
Yeah, so like you guys said earlier, if there's a breach of the vendor, it's your breach too. And so all the things that you have to do, you're obligated to do around data privacy, you have to make sure that your vendors are doing. So as part of your standard operating procedure, you need to, as is implied here, is really do a thorough risk analysis of every vendor that you decide that you're going to use, and then keep doing that every year because your needs change. So you have to make sure that those needs are reflected in there. So in terms of things that you would ask them typically are, for example, if you were HIPAA, are they following the same rules? Do they have a GDPR contract? If you're, a lot of these things you can inherit their contracts. And then for other things, you can make sure that they're following legal terms substantially the same rules that you are. So if you have to report a breach in a certain time, are they going to report the breach in a time that's going to be acceptable for you to report the breach, and and so forth. So I think part of the policy is you have to go through and see what are your obligations, and then how do you line those up with the vendor, and how do you make sure that Siri's not talking to you. How do you make sure the vendor's doing, what they need to do? And one of the tricks also is to keep in mind is limit your vendors. Like, I'm not saying just don't use the vendors you need to, but don't use every single cloud storage provider and every single, email provider. Just pick one that you understand well and stick with that and limit everybody to that, because that's going to make it easier to do these analyses and stay on top of them, and also greatly reduce your risk in the context.
Those are great tips. Thank you.
Alrighty, so we should have now a score between 0 and 11 for your procedure score. So what we're going to do is we're taking the score that we calculated previously, the risk rating, right? That was the one where we combined the volume and value scores, and you got low, medium, or high. So now we have that on the left side, and we're combining that with our procedure score. So let's say I got a medium in my risk rating in the last graphic. And for example, if I got a 9 as my procedure score, medium and 9, that puts me at good. So go ahead and take just a moment here and record your policy rating. Go ahead and write that down as well.
I would be really interested if anyone wants to share in the chat, you're welcome to share exactly what you received in the policy rating, but also if it surprised you, right? Are you sort of doing better than you expected? Are you doing more poorly than expected? That would be very interesting for us to hear from you.
Okay, great. So this is going to be the last section of our risk assessment. So we're calculating a tech score. So here we're going to be thinking about what are the technologies that your organization is using to secure that information. Okay. So same thing as before, 1 point per statement. Here we go. So we use multi-factor authentication for all administrator accounts. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's usually when you log in to an account, it'll ask for additional steps to verify your identity. So for example, it might send a code to a specific phone, and you have to enter that code in order to access the account, that kind of thing. Next, we use MFA, multi-factor authentication, for all accounts. All of our data, physical and digital, is stored exclusively in systems with centralized access controls and detailed logging. We have 3 or fewer administrators in our environment.
I want to pipe in real quick with that previous point about all of our data, because that was a question actually from our registrations.
Okay. Great.
So thinking about that, you know, it's very likely that we still have physical data, whether that's old medical records or whether those are filing cabinets, right? Maybe old HR records as well. And we want to think of not just our digital data, but also our physical data is secure. So when we're thinking about that, exclusively in systems with centralized access controls and detailed logging, what might that mean? Centralized access controls means that you can revoke somebody's ability to access, right? So that's really important. And that could even be, I mean, in theory, it's a very simple version, but if you change the locks on something, you eliminate somebody's ability to access, right? Logging, though, is knowing when something was accessed, and that helps to identify if there was a breach, who may have accessed it, how much information they may have accessed by knowing how long they're in there. So for physical information, you might think of, you know, how you're securing it, what kind of lock system you're using, and whether there's any sort of monitoring of that, whether it's there's a keypad that may store this information, whether there's a security camera, whether there's access logs from the building, things like that. So those are kind of some ways to begin thinking about that physical information.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, moving on to the next one. Staff only have access to the minimum amount of data they need to do their jobs. So think about if you have a website, does everyone that needs to access the back end of the website, do they have access to everything there, or just the information they need? Just as an example. We perform phishing testing to train our users not to open questionable emails. If you're not familiar with what phishing is, that's when you receive an email that is disguised as a reputable source. So for example, an email that looks like it's coming from Google, and it maybe is asking you to go log in somewhere. Usually these types of things are malicious. They're trying to steal credentials. And so you want to make sure that the people at your organization are familiar with what phishing is and have been trained to identify these types of emails or messages. Next, we have a centralized system to monitor and enforce computer updates. We use data loss prevention monitoring to look for PII in unsecured email and documents. We have device level encryption turned on for every device, work or personal. And this could be even thinking about whether your employees are logging into your organization's systems from their personal computer. Is their personal computer secure? Is that hard drive encrypted? Even something like that is something to take into account here. only devices, work or personal, we know are encrypted and updated are allowed access to sensitive data. Okay, so you'll add up your score, you'll get something between a 0 and 10. So again, we're going to be using our risk rating as a part of this calculation. And that was the one that we got from the first graphic, right? So we have low, medium, and high on the left for our risk rating. And then on top, we have our tech score, which we just calculated. So if I had medium risk rating and a 5 in the tech score, then I have an okay security rating. So go ahead and record that now as well. Great. So now you have a few scores that you can use to kind of diagnose your organization. And what do you need to do now? Let's say you had a rating that was lower than you expected. How do we improve that, right? These are some of the first steps that you can do in order to start kind of creating policies, creating a plan at your organization in order to track the information and determine what are the best steps in order to secure that information. So first, what you want to do is make a list of all of the types of PII that you have at your organization. And that could be, again, any of those types that we listed before. And you want to be sure that that you are aware of where all of this information is as well. Okay. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, sorry. Next, you want to know what are the reasons why you are storing that information. If there's information that you do not need, then why are you storing it? Is there a legitimate reason that you need to store this particular information? If not, then why is there a reason that you should have it? It's an additional risk, and there should be policies in place for you to be removing that information or deleting it. Okay, so like I said earlier, it's important to know where all of this information is stored as well. So we're thinking it could be on any organization phones, computers, it could be in the cloud, it could be in a hosting server. And so you want to be searching for where all the locations of this information are stored. You might have to think a little bit creatively in order to find all of these locations. You might need to check external hard drives, tablets, flash drives, voice recordings might have this information in them, even your social media posts. So be sure to check in all corners and definitely take your time on this step and do it very thoroughly so you can find all the locations where this PII is being stored at your organization. Next, you have to secure the data, right? And there are lots and lots of ways to do this. And we'll go into that a little bit later. And I'm sure Eric can also help us out in detailing some of the ways that you'll be able to do this moving forward. Then you want to decide for how long it is appropriate to store the data. Again, if there's data that you do not need anymore, there's no reason to be storing that anymore, and there's no reason to have that risk sitting on a hard drive somewhere. And lastly was to, there we go, create secure processes for destroying info that has outlived its purpose. So just like I mentioned, being able to have a policy established at your organization to remove that information from these places, to delete it.
So thinking a little bit about which laws apply, because this is the second big part of this equation, right? The first part was to really understand your level of risk and the impact that that would have on your donors, constituents, beneficiaries, staff, right? And the second part is to understand which laws apply, because some of this can seem very overwhelming. GDPR, for example, is very extensive. It may not apply to this level where you need to worry about strong information on political leanings and things like that. So start by understanding which laws apply. We do have an evaluation that we created to help people understand this, and there's a survey linked to that in the slide after this. So that will help you to understand, which laws likely apply to your nonprofit from the US or EU. Then here's a link for privacy laws around the globe. And this will be sent to everyone who attended the webinar. So I saw there was a question in the chat about that if your nonprofit is mainly located overseas, although keep in mind that your donors, if they're located in other countries, they're going to have privacy laws that apply to them as well. And then from there, how do you begin to get compliant? So once you know the specific laws that apply to your nonprofit, then you're really thinking about changing behaviors and tech to meet those requirements. You want to make sure you include as part of that a plan for how you respond in the event of a data breach, right? You don't want to have to find yourself in the moment where there was a data breach and then try and figure out what you're supposed to do and what are your reporting requirements. Having that in advance. And once you know which laws apply, you'll know what those requirements are. So then you can just kind of follow those steps in an event of such a situation. Almost definitely, you need a current privacy policy on your website if you have a website. That's the law for that is CalAPA and applies to all California residents. So if you have a website, you probably have a California resident browsing it. There's a lot of them. So you can pretty much take that one for granted. And same thing with needing a risk assessment that you take action on. So that is in part why we did this exercise as well. That is from the New York Shield law. And again, if you have any information about a New York resident, then you're held accountable to that law. It doesn't matter if you're a nonprofit, doesn't matter how small you are. So, they can be actually relatively simple to comply with these things. I know it sounds overwhelming. It does take planning, but it is achievable even for very small organizations, right? You really want to just think about this culture of keeping data secure. A lot of things like two-step passwords are kind of standard options that you can turn on in even free tech and things like that. So it's a matter of getting used to doing these things. We actually went through this as an organization ourselves this past year in terms of getting compliant with Shield. We have about 30 people, so we're not the smallest of small, but we're also not huge. And so we found that we really had to pay attention to which data we were saving and make sure we created a system to delete old data that was no longer relevant. That was a big thing for us. Then we were getting consent, so people were knowing when we were saving their data and how it was being used, and the privacy policy on our website and things like that. So just to give an example a little bit, speaking personally, GDPR can sound particularly very terrifying, but those big things are, making sure the data is secure, making sure that people are giving their consent for how you're using it, and then deleting data that you no longer need. If you don't do those three things, you're well on your way to being in good shape. So if you can set that up. And then, finally, thanks for joining us. And a couple of tools to help you out today. So first, if you're wondering which privacy laws apply, I mentioned earlier that we have a quiz or kind of a survey or evaluation that you can take that will help you to understand that. We are also offering, so one of the things we do is that we have a privacy policy tool as one of our services. We're offering a free month of that tool. You can email here at this email address with Data 21 by the 31st of January. And then if you have HIPAA questions, sharing here an email from Lexi for people, you can get in touch and ask questions specifically about HIPAA. So I'm sharing that information now in the chat just to make it a little bit easier to copy and paste if you'd like to do that. And then, I'd like to go ahead and open the conversation now for any questions that may not have been addressed, and we'll try and cover those now in the remainder of our webinar. But I certainly hope this has been extremely helpful. We will again be sharing the recording and the slides, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions you may have now.
There's a bunch of open questions in the chat right now. I could go through and answer some of them. I think that would be useful.
Yes, I'm sure people would really appreciate that, Eric.
So if I don't answer your question, I'm cherry picking a little bit, just in the interest of time. And I'm going to go backwards just because it's been scrolling in front of my face. One of the most recent questions is, can this be outsourced to a consultant? And I would say, if your organization can afford it, that's absolutely an amazing thing to do. Hire a consultant. There are many firms out there that specialize in helping you become compliant, certifying your compliance, helping you do the risk assessments. And it can be expensive. You can get, so it's a tiered thing like usual, but you should know that a consultant can't do it in a vacuum. If you decide to go and hire a consultant to help you, they're going to bring the knowledge of the context to you, and they're going to have to work with you through a lot of meetings to really understand what your organization is doing, how you're doing it now, what's documented, where it's like all the stuff you have to know, they're going to like pull out of you, right? So it's not like you can just hand this off and pay them some money and you're done. It's going to be work, but at least you're going to have to not figure it out all by yourself. Highly recommended. Someone asked earlier about the difference between privacy terms and privacy policy, and do you have to have, what are the difference and how do you get to have both? So as we mentioned here, everybody's privacy policy is essentially how your staff is treating data in a public way. What are your statements around how you're going to protect people's data that you're going to show to the world and that you're going to abide by? That's your privacy policy. That has to be on your website. And probably anytime you're collecting information from the public should be agreeing to your privacy policy for compliance, right? So before they enter like an intake form or give some information, there should be a little thing that says, yeah, I'd agree to the policy, here's the link to it. Privacy terms, I mean, obviously, when you get to nomenclature, things mean different things to different people in different contexts, but privacy terms are often found in contracts. So when you talk about terms, you're like, okay, what am I going to agree to contractually? What are we going to both sign off on? And so that kind of thing wouldn't necessarily be on, wouldn't be on your website unless it's part of a website around, here's my legal standard agreement, here's my legal acceptable use policy, like all these types of things that may or may not, apply to your particular organization. It's not like the standard terms and conditions that the customer is applying, subscribing to. The question about Google products is a good one because it opens up a sort of a wider discussion. Someone asked, what are your opinions on using Google products for storing data and email and everything? So it's a tough decision because Google is so widely used and they have such a intertwined ecosystem from email to docs, and everybody's used to it and schools are using it. So it's really easy just to jump and use it. And there's a lot of utility in that. But you have to understand the risk in that as well. The risk analysis for Google, even though you're not probably going to pay Google for that, they're still a vendor and your private data is there. So how is that data being used? Google has a history of not wanting to do evil, but also not being privacy focused. So how are they sharing things around? What are they doing? So you got to really understand that. There's not necessarily a lot of control around who can share what with whom in Google. So as soon as you start using docs and sheets everywhere, it's kind of easy to lose control of where these things are going and who has access to them and to shut that down. So you have to think about that. And one of the bigger things to consider when you're picking or allowing use of Google, for example, is around phishing. Since everybody uses it, there are a lot of phishing emails around things pretending to be an email from Google. Oh, your Google Docs thing, your password's expired, and like, oh, I guess it has. And if you're not using Google at all, and it's your policy not to use it, and those messages come in, then it's going to be pretty clear to everybody that that's garbage, right? So that goes back to when you pick your vendor, pick a very small, well-defined subset everybody knows about, so that everything else, is noise. I'm not going to get an email from Microsoft about Microsoft stuff if we're not using Microsoft, So I'm not going to tell you do or don't use Google. I just think there's a lot of things to consider more than just, my new IT guy likes Google, and so therefore we're going with it. Let's see. I answered the question about phishing in there, so please grab that site. They're really good. We've used them before. There was a question about NIST frameworks. So if you're in technology for your company, one of the things that you really should do for general good compliance is to have a foundation in your organization of, are you going to pick a good security framework where somebody else who knows what they're doing has said, these are the things that are important. You're not just making up out of your head, writing down things from this webinar and that webinar. The NIST framework, certified by our government, is a good solid foundation to build on. HIPAA builds on it, lots of things build on it. So yes, it's a very good framework. And how does it help? If your team takes that framework, it will lay out a wide scope of things that you have to do to be properly secure. Everything from encrypting data to logging who has access to what, to validating least privilege, like many of the things we've talked about here and many other things. It's going to lay them out in clear detail. So you can go through and make sure that you're doing them at least to your current ability, and then lay out a roadmap of things you'd like to do in the future so you can continue to iterate on your compliance. And then, after you've done that, as your organization grows, you could take the next step and hire a consulting company to certify your compliance with NIST. They will go through with you and see that you're actually doing it. You can prove it to them, and you can get a seal of approval saying, yes, we meet these guidelines. You can go to a company like High Trust, where you can get them to certify you're doing GDPR and NIST and this and that and the other thing. They can check it all for you. And that seal of approval then makes it much easier for you when you are talking to customers who care about this, or you're talking to regulators who care about this, to show that you've been doing the best you can, right? And here's the proof that I'm doing the best I can. So that it's a very sort of fundamental thing to start with.
Much, Eric. I realize we're actually at the hour already, so we need to start wrapping up. We did have one question from Kara Copeland, who was just asking if you could repeat the name of the framework that you had just talked about. And then I know that there are still lots of other questions, so I encourage folks, if you didn't get a chance to have your specific question answered, please reach out to Luxai at the email below. Or reach out to Elevation. We've shared our contact information as well, and a final reminder that we will be sharing both the recording and the slides for follow-up. So Eric, I'll let you answer that question about the framework, or if there's anything else super pressing as we wrap up.
Yeah, sure. So 2 points. One is the framework was NIST, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a framework produced by the US government that the government uses themselves as a framework for what people should be doing. It's a great place to start. And another great thing to do, especially for smaller organizations, is to outsource your risk, right? So if you have to do email, you have to deal with your website, all these places where you have risk around cyber, is to pick companies that you can trust, like a Luxai, or like other ones that have well-documented histories of paying attention to security and privacy, so that you can hand them that stuff, be confident that they're doing the right things, and you can focus more of your time on doing what you need to do.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And again, a special thanks to Eric.